And we talked about the reasons that the U.S. was expanding into other territories. What are the reasons the United States is expanding?
Their resources and markets.
Markets, resources, what did you say? Okay, so build our own empire, have our place under the sun. We want to exert some control over the Western Hemisphere, but also the Pacific Ocean, and control the sea routes, trade routes through the Pacific. All right, so the Spanish-American War, it is along the lines of imperialism, but it is our involvement in the Spanish-American War is based on the fact that we have this whole Monroe Doctrine, that we're going to police the Western Hemisphere. Well, Monroe Doctrine is that the Western Hemisphere is closed, and that if countries over here are having problems, we will handle it, okay? So the Spanish-American War occurs in Cuba. I'm going to skip this. Y'all know what foreign policy is? Okay, let's talk about it. Some of you don't know what it is. Okay, it's how we interact with foreign countries. And our foreign policy up until this kind of age of imperialism had really been isolationist. When President Washington leaves office in, I think it's 1796, he gives this farewell address where he essentially warns the nation that we need to kind of keep to our own business, okay? We need to take care of growing the United States, growing our economy, growing our military, and stay out of European problems. By 1898, so by the time we get into the Spanish-American War, that policy has slowly changed, okay? We have started gaining territories for ourselves. We have gone into different areas in the Caribbean and Latin America for resources. We have purchased Alaska. We've gotten a bunch of islands out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for different resources, different establishment for different naval bases. So our foreign policy has changed. We went from being isolationist and only worrying about the United States to really expanding our influence across the world. When it comes to foreign policy, the Constitution gives the President and Congress control, kind of split control. The President and his cabinet deal with the day-to-day diplomacy. They're the ones who have phone calls with world leaders. They're the ones who negotiate deals with other countries. But it is Congress that funds these deals, okay? So these two kind of have to be in line with each other for the foreign policy to work. I already told you Washington warned against foreign entanglements, and so for the first 150 years or so, we remain isolationist. Now, we do start expanding before the Spanish-American War, but we do not get involved in other conflicts until 1898. Our reason for involvement in foreign conflicts or expanding outside of our territory, security, our own national security. We've talked about trade and raw materials and promoting American democracy. We talked a little bit yesterday about spreading civility and Christianity to other areas of the globe. In terms of the Spanish Empire, by 1890, the Spanish Empire is pretty much on a decline. They have a couple of colonies left. They have Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and a couple of islands, Guam and a few other islands out in the Pacific Ocean. In Cuba, the Cubans have been fighting for independence. They have like this entire revolution against the Spanish government. They want independence, they want self-determination. Cuba is mostly peasants. Most of the people there are poor. They work on sugar and tobacco plantations that are mostly owned by U.S. investors. So very similar to the situation in Hawaii, in that the sugar companies own and control a lot of the territory in Hawaii. In Cuba, the United States has investors who control quite a bit of the economy there. The U.S. puts a tariff on sugar in 1894, which slows the trade of sugar between those Cuban exports of sugar from Cuba to the United States. And when you slow down trade, when you put a tariff on a country and it slows down the trade, what happens is people end up unemployed, right? Because if you can't sell your products, you're not you're not producing any more of it. In 1895 to 1898, a guy named Jose Marti and some other Cubans begin to push back against the Spanish Empire. They leave Cuba, they come to the United States, and they essentially form this revolutionary force, if you will. They return to Cuba. They claim that Cuba is independent from Spain. It is its own country. They're allowed to make their own government, and they want self-determination, right? They want independence and autonomy. Spain does not want this, okay? Spain is like, no, you're still part of our territory. So they're gonna send in the Spanish army or the Spanish Armada, and they're gonna use some pretty brutal methods to try to put down this revolution. They view these people as just rebels, okay? You can put down the rebellion and regain control over Cuba. What happens in the process is that the Spanish are pretty brutal to the Cubans. They round up a bunch of these rebels or people that are pushing back. They round up farmers and workers, and they put them in, I'm not going to say concentration camps because it's not the same, but they essentially round them up and detain them. A lot of farms are burned to the ground, a lot of plantations are burned to the ground, and so the issue from that is that there's famine and starvation, and there is disease. In the United States, we're like, yeah, that kind of sucks, but we're isolationists, we're not really going to get ourselves involved. Until a couple of journalists decide to expose what's happening in Cuba, and they do it not really to bring awareness so much as it is to sell more newspapers. They realize that if they put these sensational stories on the front of their newspaper, people will go out and buy them. What's happening in Cuba is a perfect way for them to sensationalize kind of world events. What happens to the public when they start seeing these newspapers is we don't want to see people starve. We don't want to see people die of disease. We don't want to see the Spanish brutally treating these Cubans. And we support democracy. We support self-determination. So this journalism is called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is led by Joseph Pulitzer at the New York World and William Randolph Hearst.
Attention jackets.
Newspapers that are most notorious for this type of sensational.
Please proceed to the back horseshoe.
This sensational journalism. And these two newspapers are the most widely circulated. So the most people are reading these newspapers. Americans, after reading this, become very concerned about the way that the Spanish are treating the people in Cuba. There is still some debate, though, over whether or not the United States should intervene, if it is our job to go in and intervene. But we see an opportunity, plus it's the Western Hemisphere, so we want to be in control of the Western Hemisphere. This is a cartoon that's published, I don't remember which one of these newspapers it's published in, but this is a cartoon depicting the Spanish as these very brutal, half human, half animal type being with this little bloody knife. And the tombstone here is talking about the USS Maine, which we'll talk about in just a second. The USS Maine is a warship that we send into Cuba kind of like to flex, not really flex, but like intimidate the Spanish. And that turns out pretty bad for us.
But weren't they like trying to like negotiate on peace between Spain and Cuba at the time?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, we want peace, but we want Cuba to have independence. That's the kind of goal of that peace. The other part of that is that this kind of falls in line with our use of our Navy as an intimidation tactic. Yes.
When you were saying you didn't know what it was called, like a concentration camp, did you mean like refugee camp?
No, like a detainment, like detaining people, almost like imprisoning them.
Okay.
But when we think about concentration camps, we think about the Holocaust, right? People being gassed to death. So it's not the same. I mean, people are starving to death. People are dying of disease, but it's more like a detainment center. All right. So two things are going to bring us into this conflict. The first one is something called the Delone Letter, which is a letter from the Spanish ambassador to, I remember, sent directly to McKinley. I don't remember if it was sent directly to McKinley. But it is published in the newspaper, and in this letter, basically, Delome calls the United States and our president weak, that we're really not gonna do anything. We're really not gonna go in and intervene on behalf of the Cubans. McKinley has a bit of an ego. He doesn't like being called weak. And so his response to that is to send the USS Maine into Havana Harbor, just to kind of say, look, you see this warship that we have, we're not very weak, and we will use our military, our Navy, if we think it's necessary. Once we send this warship into the Havana Harbor, at first everything is fine, but a random explosion happens and the Maine is sunk. I think 258 sailors are killed in this explosion. And immediately the US press, these yellow journalists, are gonna blame the Spanish. They're gonna say that the Spanish attacked our warship, it was unprovoked, and they killed American sailors. And that is what is going to enrage Americans enough for us to want to go into war against Spain, because this is considered an act of war. Now, to this day, it is debated whether or not the Spanish actually attacked us here. Some people still believe that's what happened. Others believe that this was something like an artillery explosion within the ship. But either way, whether they attacked us or didn't, that was the story. Okay, that's what the American public was told, and that's what is published in the front of the newspapers. That is going to get American support to declare war on Spain. Hearst and Pulitzer papers blamed Spain, and Americans were pretty mad. I'm going to go back just a second to this newspaper. This isn't the one. There is a newspaper, I'll pull it up here, actually it was in the cartoons we did, where the front page of the newspaper, the big section of the newspaper, was blaming Spain for sinking our warship, and that, again, changes public opinion.
Can you go back to the one with the guy right after the newspaper? Sorry, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
All right. So President McKinley is going to ask Congress to declare war on Spain in this document called the Teller Amendment. And Congress is going to authorize McKinley to go to war with Spain on one condition. We're going to go in, we're going to defeat the Spanish, we're going to give Cuba their independence, but we are not trying to annex Cuba for ourselves. Okay, we're not trying to gain new territory from this. That is the agreement that is made. The U.S. promised to help Cuba gain independence, and then as soon as we help them gain independence, we're going to withdraw our troops from Cuba. That is the deal. And we somewhat hold to that agreement. The other day we were looking at, me and Carson were looking at one of these cartoons, and I asked him about the positioning of Uncle Sam in this cartoon and the size of Uncle Sam relative to the size of other people in this cartoon. And not this particular cartoon, but the cartoon we were looking at. If we look at the image of Uncle Sam here, this cartoonist has made Uncle Sam the hero. Okay, he is the biggest figure in this cartoon, meaning he is the most important figure. He is, obviously Uncle Sam is always dressed in red, white, and blue, but he is draping the American flag around himself, but also around these Cubans. And if you look at this caption here at the bottom, it says, "Save me from my," I think that says friend.
Yeah, it's just
Hard to read from this angle. And it's basically that Uncle Sam is gonna go into Cuba. We're gonna help the Cubans, protect them from the Spanish, get their independence, and their self-determination. These cartoons are really, really popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Really all the way, these type of cartoons, probably all the way until 1920. These cartoons that really make America, or our foreign policy centers us as the hero, okay? And in Cuba, we are going to help them gain their independence. That is true. We're going to defeat the Spanish in less than 6 months. And not only are we gonna defeat the Spanish in Cuba, we're gonna defeat the Spanish in the Philippines as well. So we're gonna fight this on two fronts, okay? We're gonna fight it in the Pacific Ocean and the Philippines. The same way that the Cubans are fighting for independence, so too are the Filipinos. So we decide we can take on both, okay? We have a navy strong enough to take on both. And if we help the Filipinos get independence from Spain, then we have a place where we can establish another sphere of influence, another location in the Pacific, really close to Asia, where we have this kind of close proximity to China. We can keep an eye on Russia, although at this time we're not quite wary of Russia yet. And we can have influence on trade and Pacific, like the movement of trade across the Pacific Ocean. In the Philippines, we're gonna send a U.S. naval fleet to aid the Filipinos' rebellion against Spain. We're gonna quickly defeat Spain in the Philippines at Manila Bay. And the Philippines will gain independence momentarily, okay? That's what they had wanted. They wanted independence from Spain and self-determination. We're gonna grant that momentarily, but not forever. In Cuba, the Rough Riders, which is an all-volunteer force led by Teddy Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy, who will later become the President, leads this all-volunteer force into Cuba and defeats the Spanish at this kind of big battle at San Juan Hill. When he defeats the Spanish at San Juan Hill, that's the kind of end of this conflict, and now we can have this peace agreement. Now, remember that before the war, we agreed we were not going to annex Cuba for ourselves. However, we are going to make Cuba a protectorate, which means that they have independence, but they are under the control and influence of the United States. The Treaty of Paris will officially end the war. You do need to know this. You need to know what we gain from this treaty, okay? We're going to gain 3 new territories. Cuba will gain its independence. The U.S. is going to gain Puerto Rico and Guam as our own territories, like we own them. And we're going to purchase the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. Okay, we're going to buy the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. That's going to cause a problem for the Filipinos, right? Because they just traded one colonial power for another. And they're going to rebel against us. They're going to fight against us until 1902 when we actually grant them their independence. But for the time being, we need to know we gained these 3 territories. We still own Puerto Rico and Guam, and like I said, we gave the Philippines back. When we look now at the map of all of this territory that we control after the Spanish-American War, we have Hawaii already, which is right here. We have a bunch of other little islands out here in the Pacific. Now we've got one really close to Asia with Guam, and even closer with the Philippines. In the Caribbean, we gained Puerto Rico, which is right here. Cuba is independent, but Cuba becomes a protectorate of the United States. The Spanish Empire, though, is basically over. Spain has mainland Spain and some little colonies here in Africa. The Platt Amendment is that agreement where we establish Cuba as a protectorate. Okay, so in 1901, 3 years after the war, we set some boundaries for Cuba. They're still independent. However, Cuba cannot forfeit their independence to another country. We do not want any other European powers in our backyard telling Cuba what to do or establishing themselves as a dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba cannot go into extreme debt. Okay, they cannot borrow a bunch of money from other countries, which will make them susceptible to attack or to a takeover by a foreign country. Now, they can go into debt with the United States and our investors, but not extreme debt. The U.S. establishes Guantanamo Bay as a naval base in Cuba. We still own Guantanamo Bay to this day. We used it all the way up until, I think it's 2000, somebody look up the year when we closed Guantanamo Bay. It's in the, I think it was under Barack Obama, but I don't remember the year. At Guantanamo Bay, we use that as a holding facility for prisoners of war. Okay, so when we spent 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, we brought a lot of those prisoners to Guantanamo to question them. 2009? Okay.
President Obama signed an executive order in January 2009 to close it within a year, but this was blocked by Congress.
Okay. So it has sat abandoned. I don't know how many years it is, not abandoned, but empty. Okay, we haven't had any prisoners there in quite some time. But we brought prisoners there. The whole reason we wanted this location was to establish a naval base, but then we used it to question prisoners of war. We do it at Guantanamo for a reason. Okay, Guantanamo, if we bring a prisoner of war from, let's say, Iraq into the United States, we have to guarantee them constitutional protections. And our Constitution is very strict about how we treat prisoners, how we treat people who've been accused of crimes. If we take them to Guantanamo, there's a little bit more leeway in how we can treat our prisoners. And when we get into the 2000s, I will talk to you all about some of the different things we have done at Guantanamo. Yeah.
I watched a documentary and it said that they took one of the people who helped out Bin Laden with 9/11 there and they tortured him there to try to figure out where Bin Laden was.
Yeah, we've done that in Guantanamo and other places.
And stuff.
Yeah, that's why we take them there, because you can't do it in the United States. But if we do it in other locations, then it's still controversial, but not against our Constitution. Okay. The U.S. can also intervene in Cuba for whatever reason we see necessary. Okay, if they have a riot, if the people are trying to overthrow the government, if we don't like who the government is, we can go in at this time period. We can go in and intervene if we want to. And this lasts up until the 1950s-ish, early 1950s, when Cuba undergoes a revolution. The Cuban Missile Crisis. But before the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is a revolution. Yeah. Okay, so the Spanish-American War marks a turning point in U.S. foreign policy. It is the end of Spain's colonial empire, and the United States emerges as a world power. Okay, we essentially, by the end of the Spanish-American War, have established ourselves as the strongest country in the world. Now, we're going to double down on that after World War II when we develop nuclear weapons and become a superpower. This also establishes us as sets the foundation for us to establish ourselves as the world police. We have demonstrated that we can take on another European empire and destroy their empire, and we can replace them in terms of being kind of the top dog, if you will. All right, we did American imperialism for the most part yesterday, so let's do this. Let's do World War I so that we can have a free day tomorrow.
Yay.
Does that sound good? And most of you should be familiar with World War I because you've done it in other history classes.